Okay. Hello and welcome to another episode of LGOtv Big Talk. Yes, we are still committing to the terrible name because I couldn't come up with anything better. And we're already like 3 weeks in. So, here we go. And I did that mostly because I hate small talk. Like, I cannot stand it. It's like organ rejection. So I only want to have real conversations with real people. And here, I want to tell you about my guest today because he's one of my dearest friends. He is the person that I text with and bitch with all day long about all sorts of nonsense. He's also the person who picks me up when I'm low and cheers me on when I'm high. When brands like Google, Starbucks, Shopify, and GE want to decode the future, they call Mitch Joel. Strategy Magazine called him one of North America's leading visionaries. He is the founder of the Six Pixels Group, an advisory, investing, and content producing company that is focused on commerce and innovation. Before COVID, since 2005, he gave anywhere from 40 to 60 keynote presentations a year to small, medium, large organizations, both in B2C and B2B space all around the world. I actually happened to watch him speak one time, and the guy next to me, I kid you not, took 12 pages of notes. Now, before we started today, Mitch said, let me get a piece of paper in case you say anything intelligent. And I promised him that I wouldn't. But you out there might want to get a piece of paper because he will definitely say things that are intelligent. His first book, Six Pixels of Separation, named after his successful blog and his podcast, was a business bestseller. His second book, Control Alt Delete, was named one of the best business books of 2013 by Amazon, and he was awarded one of the highly prestigious Top 40 Under 40 awards. But here's what I think is the coolest thing about Mitch. His first professional job was interviewing Tommy Lee from Motley Crue. He then went on to become a music and entertainment journalist. He is and a publisher of magazines. And with that, he also co-launched Distort Entertainment, the only hard music label in Canada to have a major label distribution, and whose roster featured Platinum Plus, Juno Award, Much Music Video Awarding acts like Alexis on Fire and City and Color. Mitch is also the host of Groove, the No Trouble podcast, where he is slowly trying to amass the world's largest oral history of electric bass players around the world. So, Mitch, my first question to you is, who is your favorite bass player of all time?
Jaco Pastorius, next question.
Okay.
I
And
was
how do
just,
you
the reason I'm saying this is because your husband and I have been texting for the past couple of days
Yes.
because John sent me a list of the 50 greatest bass players according to Rolling Stone magazine. And I wouldn't say it was laughable, the list, but if you are doing anything related to the bass, and Jaco Pastorius isn't number one, I'm just immediately like, okay, like it's going to be a bit hoity-toity and stuff like that. And so we were debating back and forth, and that's why that was my bad attempt at inside humor on a live podcast where nobody knows their husband or me. So that was great.
Well, my husband actually agreed with the number one on the list, James Jamerson. But I think he was shocked, like you were, that Geddy Lee was number 24.
Yeah, and John Entwistle from The Who was ranked in a weird place. And it's, I don't know, Rolling Stone just reminds me a little bit of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And it winds up being too somewhat sanctimonious versus like, what does the general public want? Like, can we live in a world where Iron Maiden is not in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? It just, so so all those lists, look, it's all subjective. James Jamerson is a genius. And would we have Jaco without James? And would we have Charles Mingus without? It's a long, sordid, ugly debate that nobody who's listening to this wants to hear.
Well, but I
Except
think
for your husband and
except for my
I.
husband, who may be my only listener. So shout out to John for being a
Exactly.
supportive husband. But as somebody who is just a lay listener to music, right? Somebody who just likes to go and enjoy listening to bands. I like, as I was reading through the list, I was reading about people like Bootsy Collins, and I was interested that they were saying, like you wouldn't have Flea if you didn't have Bootsy. And really for me, as somebody who really likes to see pattern in background and history, and I think this sort of relates to a little bit of what we want to talk about with you about decoding the future, is it's interesting to see the remnants that people have. There's some, nothing is original, but they're all homages to other people, and to sort of see how they described heritage, I thought was more interesting than just the ranking system itself.
Well, it is. And it is somewhat related to almost everything I can, cogently talk about, which would be the fact that music and bass players, similar to speakers, similar to business leaders or businesses, is not a meritocracy. And it's a very tough thing for people to hear or believe or understand, because you want to believe, if I work hard and do really well, and I am the best, I'm the most qualified. I mean, you did this in HR for countless years. It's not a meritocracy. The best candidate doesn't always win. In fact, rarely wins, because best is somewhat arbitrary. More often than not, especially in music, arts, and business, it's not. It's not a scientific thing. It's not just based off of how much revenue you have. And it's hard for people to sort of hear that and look at that in life and in everything. And I look at my own life and I go, lot of luck, a lot of luck. Like, am I better than some people? Sure. Am I worse than others? Yeah, probably more. It's not a meritocracy. It's a lot of luck. It's a lot of movement. Jaco Pastorius died at a very, very young age, and he impacted the instrument in a way probably nobody has. His solo album, of which there was only one, did okay. I mean, it wasn't a meritocracy. He wasn't a globally renowned name. We could name a million bass players or musicians who were way more successful, made way more money. But it's not a meritocracy. Sorry.
Yeah.
I didn't make the rules.
Right. I mean, I didn't know who Jaco Pastorius was until I think the first time you mentioned it to me.
You shouldn't. Nobody should.
When John sent me the list, because he said it to me, he said, here, send this to Mitch. And I was like, you sent it to Mitch. I don't want to be the go-between, because I know this is going to be a very long text chain conversation.
And no offense to you, I'd rather speak to him about it as well.
100%. But I looked at the list and I was like, well, who do you think is number one? And he said James Jamerson. And my reaction to that was also,
Who's that?
Who's that?
But that's also the second part of meritocracy, which is sometimes the people who've had the most impact are not the names you know.
Yeah.
And I talk about this all the time. Like for me, people like Seth Godin and Tom Peters have been hugely impactful. I was going to call them mentors, and they are mentors, whether they're physically or not in my world. The average person doesn't know what they look like. The average person will walk by them in an airport. The average person doesn't know. We live in a world of micro niches and micro celebrity. And even people who've generated millions of dollars and are top of their game, in theory, are somewhat unknown. On any given day, you could listen to radio and hear handfuls of songs that James Jamerson played bass on, and songs that if I told you now, you'd be like, of course I know that. But you would never know who that is, and he would walk amongst us as a mere mortal when he's not. And that's the other part of life that is somewhat surprising. Like my favorite story with this is when I published my first book, 6 Pixels, I was in New York at my publishers, which is Grand Central Publishing, which is owned by Hachette. And we were waiting in the lobby, and it was so nice. Like, they always put your book out in front as if it's always there. You know, they know you're coming. They're like, oh, quickly go scramble and find a copy of this book so he doesn't feel like a loser. And
authors are narcissistic whores.
Yeah. It's great. It's so true. I could just see, I could see the second I walked away, they're like, who's the next author coming in? Like, put their books out. And I was standing there, and there was another, I didn't know who it was, but there was 2 people standing there. And my agent knew the other person, which was like your classic New York agent, like dressed like in twill and like a hat. And I have visions of it now where he looked like Sherlock Holmes. Like, I don't know. The pipe and the whole
arm
look.
patches, all of it.
Yeah. And Jim Levine, my agent, walked over and was talking, and then introduced me to who it was, to who he was standing next to. And the person who was standing next to sort of looked, kind of like me, I guess, more hair, glasses, cargo shorts, like sort of tattered plaid shirt. And it was Michael Connolly. And
Nice.
I was like, oh, wow. Okay. Like, I know that. I'm not even a fiction reader, but I know that name.
Yeah.
And, after, I was like, it's crazy how like somebody that famous and that well known can walk amongst us. And I would have walked by him a million times on the streets and never stopped him. And I recognize he has more facial recognition than most, but still, there is that in life. And again, it's an amazing world we can live in where nobody knows any of the heroes in my life. And I think that there's nothing wrong with that, actually.
So there's two things. I want to talk about the different kinds of fame, right? Because you work with brands, you work with companies, you work with, you are an advisor to so many companies, and and you work with me, quote unquote, work with me because you're basically my therapist. So and so I want to talk about different types of fame, but I also want to go back to the point you mentioned earlier, which is about how some people get lucky, right? There's lightning in a bottle. And I remember as I was writing Limitless, I was like, I have to do all these things to make sure that it's successful. And you're like, you could, and maybe it won't be, and maybe it will be. And the day that
Yeah.
Robin Roberts tweeted about my book and sent it out on Instagram and all that to her millions of followers, I remember getting in the car when I was picking up my younger son, and he was like, "That's kind of a big deal, right?" And I was like, Yeah, it's like a huge, ridiculous, unbelievable deal." And his first words were, people wrote better books than you, right?" I was like, "Dude, screw you." What? And he was
But
like,
he's
"Yeah,
right.
and other people worked harder than you, right?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
don't you think?" Was like, and he was like, "Yeah, but I just want you to recognize how special this moment is because so many people have done even more and worked even harder and put even more into it. And there is a ton of luck, right?" So there's this question of like, what is lightning in a bottle and how do people catch it? And how, like, are there things that people, maybe there's things that you can do that are right that help you get there, but there are probably things that you're doing that are definitely wrong that take away. And I'm wondering if, like, as you're giving people advice on, as they're working and as they're thinking about how do you get something to take off, what is the
Yeah.
advice you give people?
Yeah. There's not a sort of clear path that this works. I mean, regardless of the life I had, it's very easy, especially in today's world, to recognize that I was born on third base,
Sure,
you
of
know?
course. Yeah, you and
And
me
there are
both.
people who are on home plate with two strikes.
Yeah.
And those people, many, lots of them have definitely passed me. Many of them have not. So one is sort of just check your privilege, which is just the sort of nature, thankfully, of our world today, which it wasn't for a long time. And I couldn't be happier that we are in this place where we are seeing people take a more microscopic look at
Yeah.
what is fair and what is just. So now let's put that aside and go, okay, so we agree that like there's just a lot of privilege and a lot of people born who are sort of sprinkled with more pixie dust. The answer on the other side is just you don't. I mean, I think if I'm reading anything or thinking about anything in terms of that, it's we're trying to concentrate too much on the outcome. And that's the outcome, is like what happened to the work. I don't know if work works well when it's not done in the spirit of just the work. I do the work because the work matters. It's the work that I do. I'm very inspired because I just came off of reading the advanced copy of Seth Godin's new book, The Practice, which talks a lot about this. It's just this sort of core idea that if you're in one foot trying to understand where this lands in the mass or pop culture, you're already doing it a disservice. If you're spending your time in the work, doing the work, the audience comes along and you build your audience, and word by word, mouth by mouth, people start talking and saying, hey, you should check this out. So getting to Robin for you wasn't, because I know the journey, it wasn't well, I wrote a book and she read it. It was steps and steps and steps of you doing very hard work that required a lot of daily focus to get to the point that that moment happened, never knowing at that moment where Robin's headspace is, and where she's going next and what she's thinking next. It landed at the right time in terms of where she was at. And then you have some momentum. So the only real answer to the question is that Stephen Pressfield, Seth Godin, do the work. It's putting in the time every day as a practice to produce things, to share whatever is inside of you with the world. And if you do that, you find an audience. It may not be the exact audience you think or want. It may not be as big as you would hope for. But every time you think about that, you're sort of going against the work, because the point isn't of how does it land. The point is in doing it in service of helping others. And if it's done that way, you start building. So if it means building a list, if it means taking Google AdWords, if it means building a good Instagram following, if it means doing a show like this, if it means writing a book, I don't know. But that, to me, when I read this book and it's coming out soon, it was a bigger clarity that often we are creating thinking, what do we want as the outcome of it, versus understanding the real outcome of the physical work. And it was illuminating to me because I thought of it before, but maybe not. When you're reading a book, you have more time to sit and soak in it.
That resonates with me so strongly because, as you know, when I wrote Limitless, I thought I was writing a business book. And if I had thought about the outcome, it would have been to get on these business lists and get in front of those business audiences. And it was you that was like, yeah, no business is going to want to bring you in to talk to their people and tell them to live a great life because all the people are going to quit. Right?
Right.
Like, you're not writing a business book. But I was so sure I was writing a business book because I knew that there's a kind of conversation that you have to have with your employees to make engagement real. And that was the kind of conversation. But it wasn't until I got called for Today and got, Robin and all of that, that the market was telling me, hey, jackass, you wrote a personal development book, you wrote a self-help book. And so if I had done the work for the outcome that I wanted and only gone there, I would have missed the whole opportunity that, of the universe smacking me upside the head and saying, actually, this is it. And the work that you're doing is resonating with these audiences. So go more into that. And I think we do get that wrong because I think we see the outcome as being like the number of likes or the number of followers or any of that. And then I think about people like James Clear, who just like wrote for 10 years, like wrote and wrote and wrote and served his audience and grew a list of 100,000 people. And then when he put out Atomic Habits, it was like, boom, pre-sale, instant bestseller, because he spent 10 years doing the work. And I think we forget about that.
Yeah, and when you ask and what you're monetizing is also a factor when you're in the business of selling what you think. So, I've had a lot of time to reflect on that during this period because I have a business partner and they rented a country house nearby here. We live in Montreal. And he was saying, how sort of slow it is. And I was like, slow, I'm drowning here between work and the kids and all that sort of stuff. I'm just like, ooh, and there's no speaking. What are you talking about? And I realized that like what I create, weekly podcast, a monthly podcast for the bass playing, a couple articles a week. I do 2 regular radio appearances. I do stuff like this a handful of times a week. I'm constantly curating, reading. I can't not do that. But the outcome of it, the real sort of thing that I'm quote unquote selling is a speaking gig. And with it, books. My second book is already a bit old by now. So I'm not really sort of pushing it all that hard right now. And it was like really illuminating to think like, okay, so like the business model of also what we sell is very impactful in relation to everything you just said as well. And you have to figure out like, what am I willing to do and what do I want to sell to move that idea forward? And so again, like you have a lot of time when you're no longer, a third of your time, let's say, which for me was about a third of my time speaking, is gone. I'm like, well, that's interesting to be in a world where I only monetize one aspect of it. And the truth is, I'm really good with that because the stuff that I don't monetize is stuff that I just would probably do even if I didn't have the outcome of speaking on the other side. And so we have to be very cognizant also when we're building things and thinking about things. What are we selling also? And the truth is, everything that you just said, just as a marketer, rallies up into know thy customer. And so when you were saying it's a business book, I'm like, yeah, I think it's not a business book. I think it's a book for people who want to figure out who they really are. There will be a business application to this, but that is at the core of it. So it's that know thy customer. And in my world, like my customer ultimately was selling the speaking gig, which is weird when I think about it.
Right, because your customer isn't, it's not the company that you're being hired for to speak to. It's the bureau, right? And if the
Well,
bureau is like, if you screw that up, I'm not going to hire you again. Like it's almost like you have 2 customers, but one takes a little bit of priority.
I meant it a different way. Like, I don't know if the people who hire me to speak listen to my podcast or read my articles. I think they see that and it's a social signal that, oh, he must be the person who talks about innovation and technology and brands and relationships and things like that. But I don't know if they're actually the same customer at all. And that's like an interesting place to be. A lot of times when we're doing stuff, it's more social proofing than it is the same customer for your book is the same customer who would book you to speak. I don't know that that's the case.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting. I mean, you referenced the journey to get to Good Morning America, and of course, you know it because you were the journey, right? Like you were the one
Well,
who introduced me to the guy who ran the conference that hired me to be on the stage where Robin was, and like it all started with you and your friendship and your faith in me. And so, I will forever be grateful to you for that. But
you
I
did the hard work. I didn't really do much of anything. If I had to write the book and then do all that, I could take the thanks for that. But look, the truth is, in my life, I meet really interesting people. I like to tell people that I collect conversations.
I used to tell
And
people that I was paid to meet strange men in hotel lobbies, but John told me I wasn't allowed to say that anymore.
yeah, it gets riskier as the career evolves. Um, but the truth is that I can't tell you how many times I've done things like that, and that wasn't the outcome, or that isn't the outcome, or how many times I've done way less and it's created a much greater outcome.
Hey, wait, there was a greater outcome? Wait, what you
Oh
holding
yeah,
out on me, Mitch?
oh
Come
yeah.
on, what's going on?
I'll tell you what I think might be the greater one, actually, which is I have a friend who actually lives very close by and was always a massive mentor to me, very involved in nonprofits, and introduced me a long time ago to a young person who was just starting out an online business. And the person was formerly from Montreal, living in Ottawa, had been through some stuff, had known my stuff, and asked if he could make the intro. I said, sure. And we wound up becoming super, super tight, even though they're significantly younger than I am. And it wound up being the co-founder of Shopify, Harley Finkelstein. And so it is one of those things where, it was way less effort in the sense of you're just sort of friends and chatting and talking and helping, and to a certain degree, not even feeling like you were being all that supportive, which I don't think I necessarily was with Harley. Um, but it's an example, not to name drop or business drop, but it shows you that sometimes it's like you're just doing things because like you're just doing them, and you're not even making the effort to try to get that person something or anything. And it winds up creating, a really big thing in their life without you really knowing it.
Yeah,
And I think that happens a lot. So people tend to go like, "Oh, you introduced me to so and so," and I'm like, "Yeah, but you kind of, wrote the book. You kind of were doing this. You were kind of on this path. You were asking questions. It happened to be good timing that we met and had a lot of similarities from just the fact of how we were brought up and similar in age and all that sort of stuff." And it wasn't like I don't look at it and go like, I put a lot of effort into building the LGO thing. Like I just don't see it like that. So.
Sure. And people on my side were like, how'd you get in the Mitch Club? And I was like, I did it. What? I didn't know there was a Mitch Club.
I didn't know there was a Mitch Club till right
Yeah,
now.
apparently there's a Mitch Club, and I got all these texts from people like, wow, Mitch really likes you. He's really helping you out. How can I do that? And I was like, what'd you do? And I was like, he was in town for Inbound, where you're on the board of advisors, and he asked if anybody would, we wrote in our little speaker group, is anybody in town? I was like, I live here, and we met for lunch,
Yeah,
and we
that's right.
became friends, and that was really all there was to it. In fact, a couple of our friends met us about a half hour into that lunch, and I heard from them afterwards that they were like, this was the first time you guys met. Like, you seem so close. Like,
Yeah.
because we are like my brother from another mother. So there was
But that's also
we had a shared language.
that's also to me, I mean, a lot of what I wrote about in Six Pixels of Separation, which came out a long time ago, my first book, is really based on that I always think that like geography is such a weird thing before the internet. It's like
Hmm.
sort of where you work and your spouse and like everyone you're connected to, your hobbies. It was all relegated to like a couple square miles within where you live. And in the book, it was early days of digital, and the real idea was that we can now have real interactions between real human beings in these digital channels. Little did I know that we'd wind up where we are today. But what I love about things like private Facebook groups or newsletters or just books and connecting to these people through more regular basis as being a blog or a podcast is that you really do expand your network. And what was amazing to me, and I mean, people have this all the time where it's like, you'll see someone that you haven't seen in 20 years and you're like, how's your ankle? And it's like, because you saw like they sprained it on Instagram or something,
Right, right.
it's like, so there's one side where you almost feel like, wow, I know way more about my second and third degrees or pixels of connections than I should. But to another extent, I think it does make the world a little bit smaller, where the people who are interested in your quirky interests, like public speaking or writing nonfiction or whatever it might be, when you meet, there is a familiarity because you're meeting someone who was seeking out the same things you were seeking out.
Right. The truth is we were already friends before we even met in person.
We had similarities, we had similar interests, we were circling the same drain, basically, is essentially what was happening. And
Little did we know COVID.
yeah, but you see it, like, and I see it on YouTube almost every night. Like, I don't really watch much TV, but I subscribe to a lot of YouTube channels, and I basically, my nightly ritual is once I get into bed, I search my subscriptions by most recently added. So basically from the moment I sat down to all the way back in time. And if I looked at it as a sort of as channel programming, as we would in traditional, it would look like the most psychotic ramblings of a maniac, because it's everything from traditional news to bass players to live rock videos to magic to comic book collectors to, like, you name all the quirky things I like. But for me, when I go through it, I'm seeing so many experts who you get to know, who you get to connect with, who you comment on, who you like, who you share. And it's made my life so much more rich. I mean, having people who are experts in magic and experts in comic books become actual friends, and then I can drag them onto my podcast or whatever. That's what makes it so special. So even when people say, like, oh, I can't believe you've never met, I'm like, in more instances than not, you know people better than if you had spent time with them. It's bizarre.
Yeah, I think of it almost akin to when my husband and I were first dating. We would send each other these long emails back and forth, back when, like, you would write emails like letters, right? And we
Right.
would send it back. And it was almost easier to be vulnerable when you're not staring at somebody face to face. It's easier to actually have those conversations and put yourself out there when you're not waiting for the immediate reaction. And I feel, certainly since, the pandemic started, doing these daily lives, I feel almost so much less inhibited. And I think actually it probably will change the way that I speak, because I feel just much more comfortable just being me and just being extemporaneous. And I think that people who have created brands on social media have mastered that art of giving information and really good content, but also being personable and vulnerable enough that you actually feel like they're showing up for you and they're not just performing a speech.
Yeah, I wish I could hit the video off and just do audio. I mean, I do, my podcast, I've been doing it for many years, and people say, like, oh, it's so great because, like, you can now sit down and see people, and I prefer not to see people. So I'm probably more like the email writer, where I find that I can be more intimate when actually it's just a voice and you're just listening. That for me seems to be the way I capture information best, is like really alone and not being visually stimulated, but just letting it come into my ear holes and seeing how it goes from there. So it's interesting that, like, so many people have picked up on video, and I'm always like, I'm more of a radio podcast person. I'm sure there's some self-esteem issues deep in that, but I just don't, like, I don't jam on the video the way people feel like they can jam, which I think is it's such a unique skill set. Like right now, I know it looks like I'm looking at you, but I'm not. I'm staring into this cold, dead eye of a Logitech, HD camera, and I find that the work to make sure that I'm doing that, and then making sure that am I close enough to my mic, say just to my light off, like all that stuff. To me, I wish I could just make it go away and I could just talk. And that's the challenge of a content creator, I think, also, is figuring out, like, which channels do you think you communicate best in. And for me, like, it's always been long form text or audio. That seems to be the format I'm most comfortable in and most competent in. And look, you're getting in great reps on this, and you've had great reps in terms of your other media appearances that makes it likable and easy for you. But don't kid yourself, like, across the tube of the internet, there's this bald person awkwardly staring into a camera, like going, can't we just turn this off and just talk? Because that's what this is.
Yeah, yeah, and so I appreciate you coming on and letting the world stare at you. The world being, of course, my husband, as we've already
Yeah.
established, is the only
And
listener.
also in my home, which is not my standard operating procedure at all, just by factor of COVID-19, it's the way it's going.
Yeah, yeah.
But here we are in my old school office.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting. I tell people all the time that I'm 100% open of about 60% of my life, and then the other 40% is like lock and key. But I can be so open with one part of it that people think I'm super open about all of it. And there's this really interesting balance of how to be vulnerable but not feel at risk. And
Well, yeah, what I tell people is, I mean, if you go online, you don't really see much about my personal life at all. In fact, you'll see nothing. One part is that being a traditional media person, there was always a gatekeeper. There was always someone saying, I'm not interested in that article. I don't want that. I don't need a radio show like that. And so when the channels of blogging and podcasting opened up, I thought this is my chance. Like, I don't need an editor to tell me I can or can't. I can publish it and see if there's an audience for it. But the more important thing that I think is a good lesson, especially in today's climate and how there's such a toxicity in the digital channels. I tell people that I'm not personal at all online. I'm personable. And so
mm,
my aim is to be personable. I like Mitch. I like his content. I like what he stands for. In a world of crazy, he's hopefully trying to show me something that's going to make me better at the work that I do or make me more motivated to do the work that I do. And it doesn't have to be personal. You don't necessarily have to see spouses and siblings and homes and stuff like that to get value. And again, I think a lot of the times when we do that, it's fine. I mean, I'm as voyeuristic as the last person. I like seeing stuff like that. I just don't like giving it. I like taking. I like voyeuring. I don't like creating it. And I think that's part of the. I think that's been part of the sort of shortness of my growth has been in the fact that I think if I was more like that, I'd probably have a bigger audience and that sort of thing. But it's a sacrifice that I'm willing to make for multiple reasons. But the point is that I think you can be very personable without being personal.
yeah, I mean, you talked about Tom Peters and Seth Godin in the beginning. I don't know that they're super personal online, but they're certainly
Not at all.
personable.
Yeah, and
They have huge followings.
yeah, and again, while I would love to, to not have two other middle or older white males as the role models for me, it's just the way that things are. Uh, it was that in the music business. One of the things I learned when I was in the music business, especially interviewing people who inevitably became friends of mine, tell me about that song. Why did you write that song? What does this lyric mean? Why is this album called that? What? And uh, when artists would reveal that, like really intimately, I don't know that it served them. I think what made a lot of music very popular and a lot of cultural content really popular is the mystery of it, is the unknown, is not knowing. And I think what also makes it interesting is your own take or interpretation of what the work means to you. It seems like you could not apply that to business content, but I think you absolutely can. So part of it for me isn't to create mystery. It's not what I'm doing, but I know that in order for something to fly, it does need to have some of that. And when it's taken away, it's less interesting.
Yeah, and maybe it's not even mystery, but it's allowing people to find themselves in the story. So if you're talking about a summertime romance and the way that the sun set just as the fog was rolling in and, wearing the other person's sweater or whatever it is, and then they tell you all about the very specific moment in time and this lover and that beach and whatever, suddenly it's no longer your summer memory. You're just hearing their summer memory.
Yeah, like as you said that, I was thinking about places like Florida or Cape Cod, and you might have been thinking about places like Marrakesh or Greece. Like we don't, and I think that ability to hear a story and attach yourself onto it and see yourself in it, it's a bit of a lost form in a world where everybody wants to not just see, pardon the pun or the expression, but the sausage, but they want to see how the sausage was made in the factory.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's something to be said about nobody wants to see the sausage factory. Nobody does. But like when it comes to other things, like for example, stand-up comedy or magic, it happens to be a world that I like. I actually like the factory more than the product. I actually don't really like, magic performances all that much, or even, I mean, I like stand-up comedy, but just not that much. I much prefer hearing that person talk about the process. So it
Yes.
depends also on what it is, but again, like Seth Godin always, like, he talks about the secret sauce. It's like everybody wants to know, like, where do you write? How do you write? And he's like, look, I don't even know the ingredients for my secret sauce. And I think that, it's not ego saying that. I think it's very true. None of us do. I mean, look, if COVID has taught us anything, it's that we have no control over anything but how we feel about things. It's basically it.
Mhm.
Some days you'll catch me feeling okay about things. Most days you find me won't catch it, feeling all that okay with things. And that's, I think, been the biggest adjustment for the people who have big brains and think too much. It's really trying to figure out, like, what happens in a world where everything you thought you knew, that you thought you were in control of, isn't like that. And there's no answer for that, right? So those are the sort of challenges that I think we need to be very understanding of, both when we're creating things and consuming them.
So I want to go back a little bit. You mentioned interviewing people. You mentioned all the time in music journalism, but I want to go back even before that, because you have always been someone who I've been struck by, not just your ability to intake and digest loads of information, but to curate it and put it out in a way where there's actually a thread that makes sense. And I think that that comes from an insatiable curiosity. And so I'm like, were you always super curious as a kid? Like, did you do magic as a kid? Were you always trying to figure out what was happening behind the curtains?
I I don't know. I know that it took me a long time, especially like speaking in public is a weird one, where you start like going, like, what was that? How did that happen?
Yeah.
And if I think back, it is true that, like, things like playing in a band in high school, and then I went earlier back, and it's true that, like, yeah, I used to actually buy magic tricks and perform at, like, kids' birthday parties and stuff like that. But when I think about it, I don't know that I was. I think I was always looking for a business angle, is what I think. I think I was always interested in like in money, like even comic books. It was like collecting because there's value. So I enjoyed reading them,
What'd you
but
charge for those kids' birthday
I don't
parties?
remember. I don't. Yeah, I remember I had one of those old school, like, luggage cases that, opened up, and I had all the tricks you could just buy at the Magic. There was nothing really all that original there.
Did you have a specific name, like Mitch the
No,
Marvelous or any, like, what
yeah,
was
no,
your
I don't know. I mean, I might have, but I don't, but I do remember, like, it was myself and a friend for a while. I do remember, like, we had business cards, like, we had, like, printed up on very early days of dot matrix printers.
nice.
So it's more that. And when I think about all of the trajectory, even in the music business, while I loved the music business, it was more, I was interested in the business side of it, or the mechanics of it more. Was that always a curiosity? I guess it was, because I can't remember, like, not playing with something and then thinking this would be a collectible too. But it's a function of, like, you and I are basically the exact same age. Like, I just think we grew up in a weird time where, like, it was the beginning of that. Like, in a weird way, it was the beginning of, like, recognizing that things were collectible, or that, and stories, and just like the sort of mid 80s, as the early days of computers, and just people laugh at 80s music. And I'm like, I don't know if I'd laugh at it, but if you look just decade by decade, it was probably one of the best decades, only because of how many genres came out of it, versus, like, other decades where it was like, peace and love and roots and folk, and then disco, and then rock. This was sort of like everything. And
Yeah, you had
I,
synth, you had rap, you had rock, you had everything. Yeah.
reggae, jazz,
Yeah.
you've got very experimental. So it's interesting to me, at least, when I think back of just how eclectic it was. And I guess because of this whole sort of Reaganomics that was going on then, that there was this sort of strange thought of, like, what could you do? And I think the advent of the home PC was a big thing. So we're talking like early to mid 80s now. It just made you realize that, like, all of this potential is going to be very, very different. And I think that was the real anchor. So even now, when Clay Hebert helped me come up with this idea, he didn't help, he gave it to me, this Decode the Future.
Yeah, he gave me mine too.
Yeah, he does that. He's a giver. Yeah. What have I
I
given
helped
him?
get
I don't
unstuck.
know.
Done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is that I think I have always spent time really thinking like, what could you do with this? This is new. What can you do with this? And that is more of the spirit of how things got, I think, to where they are, and how they don't end, because I'm always like that. I'm like, what can you do with this stuff? Like what's going to happen? All this stuff that we're using now to communicate, I didn't buy it to do like live video. I bought it because I was like trying to figure out how to do a podcast, and then maybe I would shoot some video, and then you buy stuff and you're like, I don't. So it's more like a workshop. And I think my entire life was like that. Like I never looked at playing computer games as playing computer games. I was like, can you become a professional video gamer? Can you become a programmer? Can you use computers to build a business? So like early days of desktop publishing, like everything connects when I look back. It just, at the time, it just seemed to me like I was tinkering around with stuff.
Yeah, it didn't seem to make any sense to me that if you finally, after waiting in line for like 2 nights in a row outside your local Toys R Us, that you could get a Cabbage Patch doll, but you would keep it in the box. Like, I didn't understand that. I am the opposite of you. I was a user. I like wanted everything in the moment.
It was both for me. It was both for me. It was both. And I think that's why, I was attracted to things like comic books or even music collecting, because you would use it. You didn't leave it sealed. I mean, those were the maniacs.
And that's madness.
But you used it, and then it became something. And I think that's always been there.
So in the movie, The 40-Year-Old Virgin with Steve Carell, when
what are you trying to say, Laura?
Well, I was going to say I can so relate to it, and maybe you can. I thought I would just start this sentence differently. Yeah. And he that when he like gets the girl and she like walks into his bedroom and he's got all of the action figures all over the place in the original boxes, and then she's like, you need to sell these, and it's like, and I could just think about that, because I just, all of those things like the lunch boxes and the action figures and all of that stuff, it really was the beginning. But I want to push you on something that you said, which is that in the 80s, that's really where the music kind of opened up, and there were so many genres. And I wonder how much of that you attribute to video and MTV, given that you're somebody who doesn't want to go on video and you're always thinking about what's next. I'm sort of curious about that dichotomy.
I don't know that there's a dichotomy there. I think that for many artists, MTV and the advent of video became a very I don't say confrontational, but divisive format.
I mean, we have a lot less ugly musicians now, I think, because of it.
There was part of that. There was part of, again, that mystery of like, will I be giving too much away of the song? Right. Do I want it to focus on the face or me racing a car versus the actual music?
Right.
To this day, a lot of the conversation about video is in relation to, was it good or bad for music? It's not necessarily seeing. Yeah, for me, because I was always a brand person, I was always interested in packaging and products, and I love the smell of commerce in the morning type of person. That's Mallrats, by the way. It's another throwback.
Amazing.
I kind of really liked it because I like image and I like brand, and I would be, I admittedly, like many bands, that looked better than they sounded. There's just no doubt about that. But I meant it more from just the fact that because of the way technology was evolving, it's hard to understand this now because we look at things and think it's so set. But the electric bass, as an example, in the 80s was only a couple of decades old. It's bizarre to think it was a very new instrument.
Yes.
Synthesizers and keyboards were relatively newish, and they were evolving. The ability, because of technology, to record multi-track and do more than just 4 or 8 or 16 tracks, software to do that, dub is overdubbing, the technology of lighting and concerts and just microphones and amplification. So no, there were some just massive leaps that were made technologically in the 80s. And I also think that because of the connectivity and because of MTV, it just brought more people to different genres. But as you were saying that, I was just thinking, because very recently I watched a clip of David Bowie just tearing into MTV, like live on MTV, about their lack of featuring black artists.
Yeah, it was like Run MTV maybe, and only during, the rap hour.
Yeah, and so again, you don't realize this because you're just a teenager at this time watching music on TV and you're living in your own bubble. But then you realize like how, again, lots of roadblocks, lots of
Mhm.
gatekeepers. And we live in this world now where those gatekeepers are gone. And it's much, I find the world more interesting now, even though it's filled with terrible people saying terrible things.
Yeah, but you also have a world in which, love them or hate them, you have people like Taylor Swift and Justin Bieber who started off just like recording music and putting it on YouTube and then getting discovered. And so, yeah, I mean, I remember watching MTV and like setting my alarm and like being in front of the TV when the Thriller video would be, it had its world debut. I mean, we all did. It was like a seminal moment in our childhood. But it is true. And I'm so interested about this. You've mentioned a couple times there is such a democratization now of access, one that we've never had before. And I used to think, oh my God, bucket list, 5,000 people in an audience, that's the greatest thing ever. And now it's like we could reach all. I mean, you have to you have to do the work and put a lot in, and we should all be so lucky to be able to do that. But we to be able to use the webcam or just the podcast or whatever it is that you're doing the good work and putting it out there, it is an incredible time to be a creator, I think.
Yeah, it is and it isn't. It is because the tools are there, they're accessible, and everybody can use it. And it isn't because the tools are there and everybody can do it and it's really accessible. So
Noisy.
yeah, it's the filter challenge. It's the curation challenge. It's
Mhm.
the uh yeah, it's the ability to like even like when we do this stuff, and you and I have talked about like I'm like, yeah, this is an hour of both of our lives that we don't get back. And tomorrow it's basically this is erased because very few people go back and go like, what did she talk about on Tuesday? Like it's just
Yes.
not. So I do still with all that have a deep respect for what I call the publish button. And that's why I'm not so noisy. I try not to be noisy because I respect the button too much. And if I feel like I hit the publish button on a Facebook status update or Twitter tweet, I want to make sure that it's something that is either helping someone else or to be blunt, promoting what I'm trying to talk about in a very noisy world because maybe somebody does want to see that instead of something else.
Yeah, I mean, you and I have talked about this a lot, where I think that there are a lot of writers or speakers or even podcasters who think about how to get the bits right. How do you get the money line and the joke and the whatever? And what it, you and I both rail against this because at the end of the day, it's about the content because people are going to make decisions based on the advice that we give from stage. And if we get the content wrong, even if we have all the funny lines in the world, we're actually doing harm. And I think that's malpractice.
Well, so the way I look at it is more like um, experience versus opinion is more like, and again, it's like,
Mm,
what are you attracted to? So I tend to be attracted to somebody who has a lot of experience and has a very acute skill set at disseminating it in some way, shape, or form.
So
It could be a
speaking
written
or writing.
article, it could be speaking, it could be on Twitter, it could be Instagram. I'm very agnostic with the platform, but I'm very specific that when I'm following, I want that person to have a tremendous. I want to feel like they have a domain of authority.
Yes.
Um, but we live in a world where people are trying to build their domain of authority. And it's hard to tell the difference between someone who's done it for 15 years and been successful at it versus somebody who's sort of worked somewhere and thinks there could be some money in doing this and is doing this and their content is good. It's just not there. And so if you have no experience with it, it's hard to know. Uh, but if you are somewhat experienced in whatever part of your career you're in, it's easy to eyeball. And so again, it's blondes or brunettes. Like, what do you like? Like for me, it's just I like someone who has a deep bench of experience, someone who's really been in the trenches, someone who's spent the time there. And I tend to shy away from those who are more opinion based. They read something, they put ideas together, and the slide looks great, or the chapter set reads okay, but I know enough because of my experience and decades of doing stuff that they're communicating it versus having done it or understood it or even taken something and added on that depth of experience to create something unique with it. So, it's the standard stuff, like who's doing it this great? Apple is doing it great. Steve Jobs, Amazon, Google. I love those companies. I'm a fanboy of all of those people and companies, but it's easy to say that and then not be able to back it up. And the truth is, most people who say that have never worked with those companies or done anything with them. At one point I've been pitched books for my podcast where it's about a specific company and the author didn't interview anybody who worked there. It's just their own sort of culmination of different quotes from other sources. And again, fine, do that. I get it. You want to write a book or you're interested in the topic. But it's hard for me as someone who's done journalism, published magazines, written books, done the work to like it. That doesn't mean it's not a bestseller and people love it. It's great. It's just not what I like.
Yeah, our mutual friend Scott McCain calls those book reports, which I think is the greatest term ever, that these people are on stage giving book reports. And it's just a totally different thing than somebody who's done their own research and is presenting their own findings.
And there are people who are amazing at giving book reports and they should be paid what they're paid and they are great at it. I would just rather deal with someone who sat in the foxhole rather than someone who heard over there was a foxhole, and because of that foxhole I have a thought. It's just a different, they're both fair. I just prefer in the foxhole.
So I know we just have a couple minutes left. So people who have heard you, who are like, yeah, this Mitch Joel guy knows what he's talking about. I can see why Laura talks about him all the time as one of her friends and mentors. How do people find you?
Oh, just Google Mitch Joel. That'll take you to all my stuff. I'm really at 6pixels.com, which is where I do my weekly podcast, which I've been doing for a couple years. And I write there. I tend to share if I'm on the radio. I'll dump the file there. But I'm super accessible on many of the platforms, and I try to be accessible to everybody and anyone who has a question, comment, or wants to just connect. Social, right?
Social. Let's make social be social.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to say goodbye. I'm going to let you drop off. I'm going to cut you off. No, all right, fine. No, then tell us tell us something that's always surprising about you when people actually meet you. Are they like, wait, I thought you were Seth Godin?
I get that. You're the other bald guy. I do get that. There's a lot of stories about that. I think because my picture is always somewhat serious, that people think I'm very serious, and I'm very dry and sarcastic and somewhat dark. And I think that if you aren't tuned into that type of humor, it might be a little off-putting.
People are terrified of you, right? You know.
No, well, that's so when I hear that, I get very oh, I hope not, because I'm just such a goofball most of the time. But thanks for making me more self-conscious than I was before when I started.
I just remember somebody being like, how did you talk to Mitch? I was like, I talked to Mitch.
Yeah, it's very weird when someone thinks you're not approachable, or when someone thinks that I'm always like, why? I wonder what it is. And I think a lot of it has to do with maybe just the professional photography shots that I have, where I'm probably not smiling. I'm just probably, somewhat stoic in them.
You're very serious.
Yeah, but I'm not. So it's surprising to hear, but thanks. Thanks for that. You're great. You're doing great, Laura. You're doing great.
See, I am somebody who helps build people up. This is what I do. So yeah, you're welcome. Yeah,
wow.
I'm getting straight A's here on this one. But look, you are somebody who is in my phone with this crazy, long head of curly, metalhead hair. So you're never going to intimidate me, because I have the receipts. I have the pictures of you from way back, because anytime I mention liking any song by any artist, you send me a photo of them and you when you were interviewing them back in the day. So
yeah, I can't hide from that. That's just for the photographic proof that I was a journalist. I was on TV. So there is stuff out there if you dig. A hairy, furry Mitch Joel, exactly.
Hairy, furry Mitch Joel. Yeah, with action figures and Cabbage Patch dolls.
Sure. You're doing great, Laura. Thanks for having me on. I don't know how this ends, but I think now's the time.
Get the fuck out of here. That's how it
Bye.
So that is our show for today. Thank you, Mitch Joel, for coming on. If you liked what you heard, please check out our channel on YouTube at youtube.com/heylgo, or you can go on Facebook, same thing, facebook.com/heylgo, or we are now dropping this as a podcast for those who don't like video. So you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, wherever you get your podcasts. Please check out my friend Mitch Joel at 6pixels.com. And if you like what he had to say, check out his podcast, 6pixels, and also his podcast, Groove, the No Treble podcast, if you are, like my husband, a fan of bass players. I will see you all next time. Bye bye.